Well, the 2 hour delay kind of screwed things up for us a little bit, but I want you to go over these videos before class on Friday, and that way on Friday we can just go right into locating the structures, not having to worry about going over what they all are. So, this first video, we're just basically going to go over the major bones of the skull. So, first thing we want to understand is that you have the neurocranium, you have the facial bones, and even they're going to be interconnected, and some of them are going to be actually paired. So you can see right here, these bones are paired, meaning that there's a right and a left side to them. Others are going to be singular bones, but you have your neurocranium, which is your brain box, and your facial bones. And if you kind of look at it, these are the main bones we're going to be talking about. Hopefully, these are going to be a review for most of you. Your frontal bone, zygomatic, maxilla, mandible, temporal, sphenoid, occiput, and parietal. So just having a basic idea of what all these bones are. We're going to go more in depth as we go through these next couple of slides. These are going to be basically flat, thinner type bones. They have to sort of conform to the brain and hold it in there. So this is the shell of the egg, and your brain is the yolk of the egg. So they can fracture relatively easy, especially the facial bones on the anterior surface. So if you look at the anterior aspect, um, there's a couple of the larger bones. So the largest bone obviously would be this big frontal bone right here, a little bit thicker, easily palpable. But there's also a couple structures which this illustration does not do justice to, and we might not actually be able to palpate them. And the first one is this metopic suture. Now, remember, a suture is a synarthritic joint, meaning there's no motion, and this is where two bones came together at one point, and now they are fused, and those, so they should not be moving. So metopic suture actually is a vertical suture which is the connection of the two halves of the frontal bone. So it should be right here. You won't be able to palpate it on yourself or on your partner because it's fused, but it's going to be sitting right there. The glabella is actually sitting right in here. It's a little depressed area in between your eyebrows. And some of these you might be able to palpate on yourself. So if you palpate right in between your eyebrows, you might feel a little depressed area. That's the glabella. And then just distal of that is the nason, and that's the intersection of the nasal bone to the frontal bone. Say the little. You might even be able to palpate that as a little ridge. There might be a little ridge where this is located. Now the orbits are actually this is the whole orbit of the eye. So picture the globe of the eye sitting right in here, and so you have your orbits. And the supraorbital margin is basically the distal aspect of the frontal bone. So this is your supraorbital margin. If you palpate down the lateral aspects, this is the lateral orbit of the eye. It's basically made up of the zygomatic bone, which is right here. And actually, if you continue to palpate, so the medial orbit of the eye is actually going to make up of this lavender bone, which is the maxilla. So you have your medial border of the eye, lateral border of the eye, and then your supra border of the orbit. If you move through the maxilla, in between the two maxilla, right in the nasal cavity, you're going to see. You're going to see right here is the nasal septum. And you can actually visually see this. If you look up somebody's nostrils, you can see the septum. It should be right in the middle, separating the two nostrils. Sometimes if it's deviated or fractured, it might jut to one side or the other. The alveolar processes is this lighter color right here, and this is where the teeth are actually situated. And again, this is synarthrotic. These teeth should stay in here and should not move. And then finally, the mandible, which is the mandibular. Right here, it's that gray drab color. So these are basically the anterior bones of the face. And we move over to the lateral side, we can still see the anterior bones right here. So frontal, zygomatic, maxilla, and mandible. But moving over, if we actually go, we're going to start on the frontal bone because we know that bone, and we palpate down here to the zygomatic. So this is the zygomatic bone, and the zygomatic bone is actually going to go and connect to this bone right here, which is the temporal. So you have temporal bone here, and it connects via this little bridge to the zygomatic bone. And this little bridge is called the zygomatic arch. And this actually is your cheekbones. When you palpate your cheekbone and your cheek kind of pops out, it's because of this zygomatic arch. Now, it's interesting because you can see right here where the fusion of these two bones is. There's definitely more of the temporal bone that contributes to this arch. than the zygomatic, but it's still referred to as the zygomatic arch. So the zygomatic bone is right here, and this part is the arch. And you can see they tried to show that by making it a different color. Now, going to the temporal bone itself, though, has a lot of really interesting landmarks, and the most major one is right here. The external, meaning outside, acoustic, meaning hearing, meatus, which is a hole, and this is your ear canal. All right, so your ear canal actually sits within the temporal bone, and just posterior to that is this very large prominence called the mastoid process, and the sternocleidomastoid muscle actually runs right here off this bone. So if you ever want to find a temporal bone, the easiest thing to do is just find your ear canal and palpate around it. You want to find mastoid, find your ear canal and palpate posterior, and you get all these major landmarks right here sitting on temporal bone. Now, sort of squeezed in between temporal bone and frontal bone and zygomatic bone is this little wing right here, and this is the greater wing of the sphenoid bone. You can palpate it if you palpate your lateral orbit of your eye right here on the zygomatic and slip just posterior. You're going to feel a little shallow depression. That's going to be your greater wing of the sphenoid. And then finally, on the lateral aspect, you have this very large parietal bone. It sits just posterior to frontal, just superior to temporal, and it's this very, very long, flat bone. Moving down to the jaw, you have the ramus of the jaw, the angle of the jaw, and the body. This is otherwise known as the mandible. So here's your mandible at the ramus, angle, body, and we're going to talk in a minute about the condyle of the mandible. And then finally, this is just the sphenoid bone. If you actually take the sphenoid bone out of the skull and the greater wing, so all of this is inside the skull. You cannot see it, and this highlighted green area is actually the greater wing, which is actually the only palpable part. So moving on to the posterior aspect, not many bones here. This sort of puke green is the occiput, the most posterior of the bones. This bump right here is the external occipital protuberance, known as the bump of knowledge. The larger your bump of knowledge, the smarter you are. And then your superior nuchal lines, which basically run right down to the mastoid processes. So there's not much in the posterior aspect of the skull. So we did anterior, we did lateral, we did posterior. Now, how do we connect all these bones? That's through sutures. And sutures are synarthrotic, meaning that they are fused and non-movable. And you have a variety of different ones. The coronal separates the frontal bone and the parietal bone. So you're going to see a coronal suture, a sagittal suture, which separates the two parietal bones, the left and right parietal bones. The lambdoid separates the parietal bones and the temporal bone from the occiput, so it's going to be obviously more posterior. The bregma is going to be the intersection of the sagittal and coronal sutures. There's actually a little T intersection where these all meet. And then finally, the vertex is the most superior point of the skull, which actually sits a little bit posterior in your skull, and you can palpate that easily enough. Now, you can't palpate these sutures because, again, they're fused. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a quick quiz and see if you can name all these different sutures and landmarks, etc. And I will post the answers later. The final thing we're going to talk about when we talk about bones is sort of the cross section. So if you take your skull and chop it in half, you can kind of see a whole bunch of different structures sitting here. Going from superficial to deep, the most superficial is obviously your skin layer right here. Just below that is sort of an adipose fibrous tissue. So yes, there is a layer of fat in between the skin and the skull bone, which is located right here. So this is bone. You can see there's a little what we call pericranium, which is some blood vessels, etc. Exist here. So that's why if you sort of lacerate your skin, you have blood that sits right here. That's why you bleed without necessarily cracking your skull. Just deep to the skull, you're going to see the dura mater, which is located right here. This sort of polka dot thing. Just deep to that is the arachnoid matter, which sits right in here. And then deep to that is the pia mater. And the pia mater, actually, this little black line which sort of outlines this, which is the brain. And the pia mater is sort of like this glossy saran wrap thing that is goods into all these little nook and crannies of the brain. So here's your brain, your pia mater, your dura mater, then your arachnoid matter. So it's really important that you understand that if you want to look at another cross-sectional, you can see skin, there's that fibrous periosteal layer, there's the bone, dura, arachnoid, pia, and then brain right here. The arachnoid matter contains a lot of blood vessels. It contains cerebral spinal fluid right below it. And so if you actually do fracture your skull and go through the dura matter, you're going to get this arachnoid matter, and that's where you get a lot of your bleeding and subdural hematomas and that type of really bad stuff. So that's why fracturing your skull can be so dangerous. So that's just sort of an overview on the skulls, the bones, the sutures, etc. Make sure you feel comfortable with it. The next video, we're going to go over the nerves and of the nerves of the brain and some of the other functions of it.